introduce our panel today, who will speak about taxes and aging and demographics.
Okay, thank you, Gilly. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers today. First, we have Dr. Burman. Dr. Burman is the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Professor of Public Affairs at Syracuse University, where he is also a Senior Research Associate for the Center for Policy Research. Prior to coming to Syracuse, Dr. Burman worked at the Urban Institute as the Director of the Tax Policy Center. And his specialties include federal tax policy, healthcare, and budget reform. And as Gilly said, today he'll be speaking about the 2012 presidential candidates' positions on taxes. And our other speaker today is Dr. Wolf. Dr. Wolf is the Gerald B. Kramer Professor of Aging Studies at Syracuse University and Associate Director of the Center for Policy Research. Prior to coming to Syracuse, Dr. Wolf held positions at the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Urban Institute as Director of the Population Studies Center. His specialties include aging and public policy, population studies, and quantitative methods, and he will be speaking to us today about the 2012 presidential candidates' positions on these topics. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a real pleasure to be here with Doug Wolf. Actually, he was one of the people I actually had heard a lot about at the Urban Institute before I came here. All of it positive. People really like and respect you a lot. And yeah, now I know why. So we decided to pick some uncontroversial topics today, talk about tax, budget, death panels, and Medicare, Medicaid. Death and taxes, that's the theme for today. So I've got a bunch of slides, which are, it's overkill for today, but I had them on hand, so I thought I would use them anyway. And actually don't know what's coming next, so we'll all be surprised together. First, I wanted to just talk about the context in which we're talking about tax policy changes. And first thing is the expiration of the tax cuts that were enacted in 2001 through 2003. A few provisions that were also enacted as part of economic stimulus in 2009, 2010, and have been extended through 2012. All of those are set to expire. In addition, there's some spending increases that are set to happen automatically at the end of the year if Congress doesn't act. And this is affectionately called the fiscal cliff. And we are apparently all heading for the fiscal cliff with a bunch of crazy drunk people as drivers. Another issue, of course, is that the economy is very weak. And one of the reasons why the fiscal cliff is especially scary is that there's a good reason to think that if all of those tax increases and spending cuts took effect as scheduled, that it could push us back into a recession. And that certainly complicates any discussion about what we should be doing in the near term. The third issue is that tax revenues are at their lowest level since the Truman administration. This is actually even before I was born. Maybe not Doug, but this was before the interstate highway system was put in place, before we created Medicare, Medicaid, before the Environmental Protection Agency was created. Tax revenues are at a really low level. Part of that is because of the recession. Part of it is because of explicit tax cuts that were enacted. Another issue is that the tax code really is a mess. Those of you who are doing your taxes this weekend, like I am, that's a little joke, but it's actually true. You can get an extension through October 15th, and of course I put it off till the last minute because I really hate doing my taxes. The taxes are just incredibly complicated. There are hundreds of tax breaks that are built into the code. They're all enacted to make various constituencies happy. The consequence really is, though, that they make the tax code kind of inscrutable and very complicated. And it is unfair, it's perceived as unfair, and it undoubtedly takes a toll from economic growth. Corporate tax rates are high relative to the rest of the world, but the tax base, corporations actually have lots of ways of avoiding tax, and both of those are thought to be undesirable features. Economic inequality is at the highest level that it's been since the eve of the Great Depression, and some people at least think that's an issue. And then there's the existential threat created by the Lucky Duckies. I'll explain that later. So first of all, what is it that's expiring at the end of 2012? President Bush 2001, and through two big tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, cut marginal tax rates. The top income tax rate was cut from 39.6% to 35%. There was a new lower bracket, a 10% bracket. They repealed PEP and Ps. I could explain to you what those are, but you'd just feel bad if I did. They're complicated provisions that are surtaxes on high-income people. There were provisions intended to lower the tax burden on married couples, particularly married working couples. That also expires at the end of 2012. There was the child tax credit was doubled by the 2001-2003 legislation from $500 to $1,000. And it was also made available to a lot of families that didn't owe income tax. There's a larger tax credit for offsetting the cost of child care. The estate tax, the tax paid by the estates of very, very wealthy people when they die, was repealed at the end of 2010. It was reinstated, but at a level that only applied to super rich people in 2011. And in 2013, if nothing happens, it'll go back to the 2001 levels, which would apply to many more estates. Capital gains tax rates were cut from 20% to 15%. Those are the taxes you pay on profits on, say, stocks you've held for a long time. Tax rate on dividends was cut from a top rate of 39.6% to 15%. There are tax breaks for savings of various sorts. There are education tax incentives, some of which you might be taking advantage of. And there were fixes to the alternative minimum tax that have been extended year by year for the last 10 years. And those have actually already expired. And I realized, I intended this to be like a 5-minute overview. When I start talking about this, part of the problem with having such a complex tax code is that this is probably incomprehensible to most of you. The alternative minimum tax was actually this thing that was put into the tax code intended to make sure that millionaires, by current standards, paid at least some tax. It was incredibly poorly designed. And right now, the thing most likely to throw you onto the alternative minimum tax is living in a high-tax state, New York, having lots of kids. Neither one of those things are actually tax shelters. I have lots of kids, and I live in New York, and they didn't do either one of those things for tax reasons. But if Congress doesn't do anything, there'll be 40 million households that will owe alternative minimum tax this year. And you would think that since it actually applies for the 2012 tax year, that Congress would have already dealt with this already. But just like some students at Syracuse University, they keep on asking for an incomplete and expecting to be able to do the work late. None of the students in this room. There also were some tax measures that were put in place as part of the economic stimulus, trying to get the economy going. The American Opportunity Tax Credit was an enhanced credit for higher education. It actually made the tax breaks to help pay for tuition expenses refundable. There was a larger earned income tax credit. This is a program aimed at low-income working families, a larger credit for families with 3 or more kids. There was a payroll tax cut. 2 percentage points were taken off of the payroll tax that pays for Social Security and Medicare, for the last 3 years. That's expiring at the end of this year. And Congress has to think about whether they're going to do anything about that. There are several temporary business tax breaks, basically to encourage new investment. And there are a whole bunch of these things called extenders. These are provisions that continually are extended for 1 year or 2 years at a time. And Congress routinely passes them all after a lot of hand-wringing and debate. And all of those things are coming up. The most popular of those is a tax credit to encourage research, called the Research and Experimentation Credit. And it all turns into a pumpkin at the end of 2012, at which point we go home and hope that Prince Charming will find us. This is historical data, just to show where revenues and spending are relative to historical levels. And you would think from some of the political debate that current deficits are really at unprecedented levels. It's true that outlays are significantly above revenues, in part because tax receipts are at the lowest level since 1949.
What's on your left axis?
The left axis is the percent of GDP, thank you. Yeah, that would be a good thing to put in the title.
And is this budgeted, on budget stuff?
This is everything.
So where's the Iraq War bump? There isn't a bump?
Well, you just can't see it because it was there was an increase in spending in the Bush administration. It went up to a much higher level than what it had been in the Clinton administration, which was actually pretty constrained on spending. Part of it was an increase in spending for Iraq and Afghanistan. Part of it was there were actually some major new spending programs that were enacted in the Bush administration. It was the largest expansion of Medicare in the history of the program, providing prescription drugs for senior citizens, 2 new wars. None of that was financed with additional tax revenues. Tax revenues were cut. They fell partly because there was a recession in 2000, 2001, but they also fell because there was a pretty dramatic cut in tax rates and those things I talked about before. And of course, revenues are down now in part because of the Bush tax cuts, in part because of the economic stimulus measures, in part because the economy is just so weak. When incomes fall, tax revenues fall as well, and they actually fall disproportionately because when you have a progressive tax system, when the average tax rate declines when income falls. But we also have there was a big increase in spending, and this was the TARP, the Targeted Asset Relief Program, and about $1 trillion of spending intended as a stimulus to the economy, spending on highways, aid to states to keep them from laying off quite so many people, those other programs I talked about. And there are also some built-in spending increase. There are some programs in the budget that automatically increase in cost when the economy goes into recession. For example, there's more in unemployment insurance claimed when there are a lot of people unemployed, not too surprisingly. There's more food stamps when people's incomes fall because more people qualify for it. So when you look at this, it certainly shows that there's a big disconnect between spending and revenues. It's not anywhere near as big as it was during World War II. And at the end of World War II, the debt as a share of GDP was larger than GDP, that the amount of money that the government owed to others outside of government was about 109% of GDP. Some people take some solace in the fact that the debt level was that high and the economy we actually were able to pay it down pretty quickly, but there was a huge peace dividend at the end of World War II, obviously. And people had a lot of built-up savings, so when the government cut spending dramatically, citizens were able to spend a lot, and they wanted to spend a lot more money. And still, there was a significant recession in 1947 and 1948, which economists think was a result of those very, very quick cuts in spending. But the point is that the deficit problem seems very daunting, but if we actually were to take steps to deal with the deficit, we could raise revenues and cut spending and get it under control reasonably quickly. The question is when we would want to do it. I think part of the election debate is about whether we should cut spending dramatically right now or whether we should raise taxes right now. And the concern is that if we did that it would actually have the effect of weakening the economy and could actually throw us back into a recession. This chart shows what happens this is deficit projections for the next 10 years, assuming current law, which is that all of the Bush tax cuts expire at the end of 2012, that the alternative minimum tax isn't patched, that the economy recovers, that's built into the projections. And what you can see is that the deficit declines fairly quickly, and it stays at a high level, $500 billion, but not an alarming level given how large the economy is, for the next 7 or 8 years before starting to increase. This actually gives some people a lot of comfort. They say, well, actually, the deficit's not that big a deal. If you look at how this would translate into debt, the debt levels would actually come down over the course of the next 10 years if we just let current law play out. But of course, nobody who's running for president in any way thinks that current law ought to take effect. And this is the chart showing what deficits would be if President Obama's budget is enacted. And what you can see is that President Obama has proposed to extend almost all of the Bush tax cuts. He's criticized them for being fiscally irresponsible, but still He supports all of them except for the ones that apply to high-income people. He would patch the alternative minimum tax or some spending provisions also that he would continue. And the consequence is that under the Obama budget, the deficits come down somewhat as a share of the economy, but then they start rising again. And the reason they start rising is because of demographics, because the population is getting older, because of rising healthcare costs. So I want to talk a little bit about spending, and I think Professor Wolf is going to talk some more about this. But this is a chart showing the ratio of working age. It says workers to retirees, but it's really people of working age to people who are 65 and over. And what you can see is that this ratio just plummets over a short period of time. That there were almost 5 workers for every person of retirement age. And by 2020 or a little bit afterwards, that ratio will fall below 3. And basically, the ratio falls in half. Some people talk of this as a dependency ratio. The number of people working paying for each person claiming benefits under Social Security and Medicare. To some people, like me, this suggests that we're going to have that the government is actually going to have to increase spending, even if we're incredibly successful at cutting or making Medicare and Medicaid more efficient. To other people, it suggests that we just have to really slash Medicare and Medicaid. But what it does suggest in any event is that there are going to be unprecedented pressures on the budget in the coming years. This chart, so there are 2 things that are actually putting pressure on federal spending. One is the retirement of the baby boomers. The fact that Doug and I and all the people that came after us are entering retirement age, and we've been promised Social Security until we die, free health care under Medicare, and when we get old and can't take care of ourselves, and if we spend down all of our assets, Medicaid will pay for our nursing home care. And those are just the demographic factors alone would mean that more people would be taking those programs. The other thing is that health care costs over the last 40 years have continually increased at a faster rate than GDP. They're increasing faster than the economy is expanding. And the consequence of that is that even if there weren't this demographic surge, if we couldn't control healthcare costs, that spending on Medicare and Medicaid would grow. This is a problem, Medicaid in particular is a problem not just for the federal government, but also for state and local governments. What this chart shows is that even if we could get spending on healthcare completely under control, that just the demographic factors alone would push spending as a share of GDP to 24% of GDP. So no change in what the government is actually, no change in what the government's doing outside of these major entitlement programs, but just the demographic factors would increase spending from about 21% almost to 24% as all of those baby boomers hit retirement. The other part of the chart, the red line, shows that if healthcare costs continue to grow faster than the rest of the economy, that spending overall will just explode. The average federal revenues have been 18% of GDP. If healthcare spending continues unabated, overall spending, according to CBO, would go to 25% of GDP over the course of the next 15 years or so. Over the course of the following 15 or 20 years, it would go to 30% of GDP, and state spending would also increase. What this suggests to a lot of people observing who pay attention to these data are, one, we're probably going to have to raise more revenues. Second, we're going to have to figure out a way to cut spending on Medicare and Medicaid in particular, and probably on Social Security as well. This chart just shows I also mentioned the corporate tax, which is something that's being debated by the candidates. This chart shows the US corporate tax rate compared with all the other OECD countries. It includes the federal tax rate, which is 35%, and the average tax collected by state and local governments. Most states also have their own corporate tax. So taken together, we've got a corporate tax burden of almost 39%, which tied us with Japan in 2011. Japan actually cut their federal corporate tax rate by 25%. So now we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Problem with the corporate tax is we've got the highest rate in the world, which gives companies a big incentive to try to move their income overseas, so it's not subject to US tax. We also have a lot of preferences and deductions and loopholes in the corporate tax, which give companies ample ways to rearrange their affairs to avoid the tax. It's the worst nightmare for a public finance economist because, the ideal thing in public finance is you want a broad base. You want to tax income as evenly as possible at the lowest rates you can to collect the amount of revenue you need. And this is the opposite. It's a high tax rate and a relatively porous base. And the consequence is that there's a lot of inefficiency that comes about from this tax, and it doesn't collect that much revenue. President Obama has proposed to close as many of those loopholes as possible and use the revenue to cut rates. Governor Romney has proposed a more aggressive cut in corporate taxes, and a debate on that I think is completely warranted. What is the AMT? This is just a funny cartoon, which some of you have seen before. But it's the fat IRS dude, taking money out of the AMT, and the AMT is complaining, hey, it's not the ATM, it's the AMT, and it was supposed to apply to the truly wealthy. It says, whatever, it's convenient, I'll take mine in 20s. The main point is that if there's not a change in policy, the AMT is going to hit a large swath of the middle class. The reason that the AMT is built into the budget, into our budget numbers, is that in theory it collects a lot of revenue. The alternative minimum tax will raise about $1 trillion over the next decade under current law. The only problem is that every legislator would lose their seats if it was actually allowed to take effect because the voters would be so unhappy about it. It's basically targeted at swing voters. So that revenue is not going to come in, but it probably needs to be made up from some other source. The other issue that is being discussed, and actually discussed a lot by Governor Romney, is this issue of tax expenditures. It's all of these subsidy programs that run through the tax code. The government, you think of taxing and spending as being completely different functions of government. And you got government agencies like Health and Human Services and Housing and Urban Development, and they run these programs. And then you got the IRS, which collects revenue to pay for them. But in fact, the Internal Revenue Service has got roughly 200 spending programs that it administers. Now, that's a controversial statement. Some people really just object to the whole idea of saying that their spending programs run through the government, run through the Internal Revenue Service. But the fact is, when you get a tax credit from the IRS to buy a hybrid vehicle, or you get a tax credit to build low-income housing, or you get a tax credit to encourage you to work, those are subsidy programs. They could just as well have been run by a traditional program agency, but for political reasons mostly, it's just been easier to put these things into the tax code. The problem is that, first of all, these things cost a lot of money. The blue line shows the tax expenditures as a share of GDP, and the overall in 2009, total tax expenditures are about 7% of GDP. That's about the size of the individual income tax. It's over $1 trillion. The number of these things has also been growing pretty dramatically. Since the aftermath of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, the numbers increased by more than half, from 140 of these subsidy programs to over 200. Governor Romney has said what he wants to do is cut tax rates across the board and pay for those cuts by eliminating tax expenditures for high-income people. And the question is, first of all, are there enough of those tax expenditure programs to make it possible to make the numbers add up? And actually, the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate last night, there was a whole debate about, there's a whole argument about whether the numbers added up. The other question is it really feasible to get rid of these things? The problem with tax expenditures is that the biggest ones, I like to talk about getting rid of tax expenditures. I particularly like to talk about getting rid of these top two, the exclusion for employer-sponsored health insurance, including the loss in income tax revenues and payroll tax revenues. This costs the Treasury almost $300 billion. And this subsidy, basically, those of us who work at Syracuse University, we get health insurance that's worth over $10,000 a year, and that's not included in our paychecks. It's a tax-free fringe benefit. We save Social Security and Medicare taxes on that. We also save income taxes. And all told, that subsidy adds up to almost $300 billion for the whole population. Next biggest one on the list is the mortgage interest deduction, which is $100 billion. Both of these things economists dislike. The tax exclusion for employer-sponsored health insurance mostly benefits high-income people. The higher the tax bracket you're in, the more you benefit from those subsidies. The people who really need help paying for health insurance get little or no benefit from the tax exclusion. It also encourages you to get more expensive health insurance. We don't have a very strong incentive to tell our employers to get a cheaper plan because whatever that costs us in wages, we might not even be aware of how much it's costing us in wages. But even if we're aware of it, maybe a third of the cost for an upper income person is subsidized through income taxes. So this is running counter to the idea of trying to get more efficient health insurance plans that would slow down the rate of growth of healthcare costs. So economists think it would be an awesome idea to get rid of this thing. How many real people do you think this would be a great idea? I actually went to a dinner party. I was at the Congressional Budget Office. I just wrote a paper about this, about how dumb this subsidy was and how counterproductive it was. It was a bunch of liberals, big spending liberal Democrats. And I actually thought I was at risk of going home hungry because they were so unhappy when they heard that I didn't like their favorite fringe benefit. The other thing is the mortgage interest deduction probably does nothing to encourage home ownership. People get the biggest benefit from it are high-income people who itemize deductions. Most Americans don't even itemize. And it encourages you to get bigger homes on larger plots of land than you would otherwise. So it probably pushes up housing prices. So it probably pushes up rents for lower income people. Probably makes housing more expensive for some people whose homes aren't big enough and whose incomes aren't high enough that they can even use the mortgage interest deduction. So it's counterproductive. It's, again, one of middle income Americans' favorite tax benefits. Getting rid of these things would be really, really hard. Nonetheless, we love talking about it. So the other issue is, I was going to go for 5 minutes, right? So,
Yeah, when does that start?
I have this problem when I start talking about taxes. I have a hard time stopping. The income distribution has been becoming more and more unequal. There was, on the eve of the Great Depression, the share of income going to the top 1% was 24%. They had almost a quarter of all income went to 1% of households. The Depression was a great equalizer. It demolished the wealth of a lot of high-income people. And then a number of factors, including the growth and the power of labor unions and this sort of golden age for industrial production in the United States, had income distribution became much flatter. The share of income going to the top 1% fell to 10%. And it stayed there for 30 years, from the 1950s through the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, in the last decade, the share increased and actually went back up to the levels not seen since the eve of the Great Depression. In 2007, 2006, I had a version of this slide, and I said, look at that. Maybe this means we're on the brink of a great economic downturn. And people laughed. They don't laugh anymore. But the fact is that a lot of people think that rising income inequality is a bad thing. I think it's bad for the middle class that sort of has had virtually no gains in income over the last 30 or 40 years. It might be bad for our democracy, that if a majority of people feel like they're really falling further behind, that they might be tempted to, they might feel like they're really not invested in the current system and back really crazy things like going on to the gold standard, or, no, that would never happen, or putting restrictions on international trade, which probably benefit the economy, all economists think benefits the economy overall, things like that. So one thing the income tax does is the income tax mitigates inequality. We have a progressive income tax. High-income people, if not all their income is from capital gains, pay a larger share of their income than lower-income people do. And low-income people actually, there's another inequality slide, which I'm not even going to talk about. It just basically just says that we used to be in the middle of the pack for inequality, and now we have the most unequal income distribution of all of these rich countries. Okay, so there's another slide I thought was going to be there, but it's not. So maybe I'll just move on. So one issue is you might want to preserve, at least preserve the progressivity of the income tax. The other thing is you might think about making it more progressive, and that's another part of the election debate. The other issue is the Lucky Duckies. And the Lucky Duckies was a term that the Wall Street Journal came up with in 2002. they had an editorial where they were bemoaning the fact that a large share of Americans didn't pay any income taxes. And they actually referred to those people as lucky duckies. And the way you got to be a lucky ducky was basically by working 70 or 80 hours a week in a minimum wage job. And you didn't owe any income tax, and you got maybe tax credits on top of that. And if you're really lucky, the tax credits were enough to get you out of poverty. Governor Perry in the Republican primary actually said that he was dismayed by the large percentage of Americans that didn't pay income tax. Mitt Romney was quoted in that video that went viral saying that he was never going to reach these 40, he said 47%. He didn't realize that the Tax Policy Center had updated these estimates. It's now only 46. The 46% of households, that they were never going to take personal responsibility, that they were completely in the Democratic camp, and that they were just a bunch of losers who were living off of government largesse. Well, it's probably helpful to think about who these lucky duckies are. First of all, a lot of the lucky duckies actually pay a lot of tax. Most Americans, there's another slide here. This is the share of Americans who pay more in payroll taxes, Social Security and Medicare taxes, than they pay in income taxes. The bottom two quintiles, almost everybody in the bottom 20% pays more in payroll tax than income tax. The second quintile, almost 3/4 pay more. Payroll tax, 7.65% of your earnings. That's all that this chart is showing, but economists would also say that the portion paid by your employer is also coming out of your paycheck. When you take those two together, for most 60, 70% of Americans are actually paying significantly more in payroll taxes than in income taxes. And that's a significant burden. If you think about 15% on an income of $20,000, which gets you barely above the poverty level for a family of 4, that's $3,000 a year in taxes. Now, those families do well under the income tax because they might qualify for the earned income tax credit, they might get a child tax credit, but overall, they actually are paying taxes. The other group of lucky duckies are elderly people. The 10% who are living on Social Security, or primarily Social Security, they don't pay any income tax because the tax system was designed to exempt most senior citizens who were just living on Social Security from tax. There's a group of very low income people with incomes below the poverty level, who don't pay tax because they're really, really poor. And then there's this 1% who has really, really good accountants. So those are the lucky duckies. So the solution, this is what the campaign debate is about: more tax cuts, especially for the rich, or the Buffett rule. That's President Obama's proposal, which is to come up with a new alternative minimum tax and a new AMT for multinationals, which is also what President Obama proposed. Welcome to campaign 2012. What time is it?
4:45.
Okay.
Time flies.
Yeah, time flies. So this is just the fiscal cliff. It basically just says that people's taxes will go up a lot if we go over the fiscal cliff. Anybody who wants this presentation, let me know and I'll email it to you. So what President Obama's proposed to do is extend most of the Bush tax cuts, except for basically the two highest tax rates, 36% and 39.6%, would go back into effect for people with incomes, couples with incomes over $250,000, singles with incomes over $200,000. He would restore PEP and Ps, which are these surtaxes on higher income people. Terrible tax policy, but probably makes sense politically. He'd restore the tax rate on capital gains for higher income people and on dividends to 20%. That's actually lower than it was before President Bush, but higher than it is now. He would limit the value of itemized deductions to 28%. This is actually another tax increase on higher income people. It's basically a kind of sneaky way to cut back on those tax expenditures. The vast majority of people would have no change in their tax liability, but for people in the highest tax brackets, they would lose some of the value of their mortgage interest deduction or charitable contributions, state and local tax deductions. It has the advantage of being pretty progressive. There's an argument that maybe you don't want to provide a much bigger subsidy rate for these things for high income people than for people with moderate incomes, but it would make the tax code a lot more complicated. He would permanently fix the alternative minimum tax so that it continued to grow with inflation and didn't swallow the middle class anytime soon. He would tax carried interest. This is basically, there are a whole set of, there's people who are lucky enough to be in a line of business where they get paid in the form of capital gains rather than in the form of regular wages and salaries. And the consequence is that Mitt Romney can have an average tax rate of 14%. The reason is that most of his compensation came in the form of capital gains rather than salaries, and capital gains were taxed at a top rate of 15%. He would tax that kind of income at regular income tax rates up to 39.6%. And then there's the Buffett rule. The Buffett rule basically says, this is named after Warren Buffett, the billionaire, who said he thought it was unfair that he should pay a higher effective tax rate than his secretary. He would pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. So the Buffett rule basically says that everyone has to pay as much tax as Warren Buffett's secretary, which I guess gives people an incentive to have Warren Buffett's secretary paid less. But it's a 30% minimum tax rate on income. It's actually eerily reminiscent of the alternative minimum tax. The alternative minimum tax was aimed at getting millionaires to pay more tax. The Buffett rule, which would just start to apply to people with incomes over $1 million, is aimed at getting millionaires to pay more tax. A more logical way to implement the Buffett rule is actually look at the loopholes that let people avoid the tax, like maybe tax capital gains at a 30% rate, which is roughly what they were taxed at in the Tax Reform Act of 1986, rather than a 15 or 20% rate. The architects of the Buffett rule have said, well, this is just, this is a first step towards tax reform. And I actually, in a blog post, said that I thought you'd have to be Prince Machiavelli to think that sabotaging the income tax was a first step towards tax reform. And then there are these tax breaks that apply to lower income people, which President Obama would also extend. He'd reduce the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 28% by closing a bunch of loopholes. He'd keep a 25% special low tax rate for manufacturing, which most economists think is the dumbest loophole in the code, but it's enormously popular. He'd establish a new minimum tax on foreign earnings, and this has a lot of populist appeal. It's basically the argument is you don't want to encourage companies to set up their operations overseas. There are problems with this because it might actually encourage companies to actually move their headquarters overseas too, so they're not even subject to US tax anymore. There's some other business tax breaks, which we can talk about in Q&A if you like. Mitt Romney's tax plan. He'd make permanent all of the Bush tax cuts, including the ones that apply to people with very high incomes. He'd cut tax rates across the board by 20%. So Obama would raise the 35% rate to 39.6%. Mitt Romney would cut the 35% rate to 28%. 10% bracket would become 8%. He'd repeal the estate tax and the alternative minimum tax. He'd keep a gift tax, which you actually have to do to keep the estate tax from becoming for the integrity of the income tax. He'd eliminate investment income taxation for low and middle income people. He'd allow all the 2009 stimulus provisions to expire, including some that actually help lower income people. So it's actually a tax increase for some low income people. And he'd pay for it by eliminating tax expenditures and by economic growth. And there's a huge debate about whether that would actually work. The Tax Policy Center, where I used to work, did a study saying if you got rid of all of the tax expenditures that we think Mitt Romney might be willing to cut, so not the ones that subsidize capital, which we think he likes, you actually can't pay for this tax cut. President Obama ran with that and said Mitt Romney's going to raise taxes on middle income people. That's not exactly what TPC said. TPC just said the numbers don't add up. Vice President Biden actually was a little bit better on it. He just said the numbers didn't add up last night. And then there was this great debate back and forth. He said they don't add up. And Congressman Ryan said, yes, they do. And Biden said, no, they don't. And Ryan said, yes, they do, which is really enlightening. It's great. It's like being back in the kindergarten. He reduced corporate tax rates from 35% to 25%. He extended research credit, some other tax breaks. he'd grant a tax holiday for repatriating. Basically, companies don't pay tax on any of their foreign income until they pay a dividend back to the parent company. What he would do is say, for a period of a year, if you pay, if Intel gets, if their foreign subsidiaries pay a big dividend back to Intel, they'd pay a lower tax rate than they would otherwise. A lot of people think this isn't a good idea because it encourages companies like Intel to think that they should just keep all their profits overseas and wait for a holiday. He'd implement a territorial system, which basically means that U.S. companies are only taxed on their U.S. income, and foreign income would be completely exempt from tax. There's a huge debate in the tax policy community about whether this is a good idea or not. So this is the average tax cut in 2015 from the specified parts of Governor Romney's tax plan. This is from the Tax Policy Center. There's actually a slight tax increase for people at the very, very bottom. And for people earning over more than $1 million, they get an average tax cut of $250,000. Governor Romney says, that's not true. That's not my plan. It's not a $5 trillion tax cut. I am going to cut a bunch of loopholes and preferences so that it's not increasing the deficit, and we're not cutting the share of taxes paid by high-income people. So here's the graph of the loophole closers that Governor Romney's talked about. You haven't seen this before, but it's news. Here it is. So basically, Governor Romney says, I've got great news for all of you people. I'm going to cut all your taxes by 20%, and there's other stuff that we'll talk about later. That's the other stuff we'll talk about later. President Obama, his plan, the color is different because the red was, those are all tax cuts. These are tax increases. And basically what he's doing is for really, really rich people, the richest 1 in 1,000 people, he's raising their taxes by over $350,000. And those are the two tax plans. And you can see that I left out a lot, but I wanted to give Doug at least a couple of minutes to talk. And actually, you should thank me because you said you really didn't have that much to say, right?
Yeah, you're taking all my lines. Come on. Well, it is true that I have much briefer prepared remarks, but that's also appropriate because you pay taxes your whole life and then death just comes for a moment at the end. So he did taxes, I'm going to do death, or at least that's the joke about what I was asked to do. What I was asked to do was talk about the policy issues that are salient in the election that have to do with programs for older people. And Len did a good job of introducing much of the demographic context that these programs play out in. The ratio of working people to beneficiaries, old age program beneficiaries, is probably the most salient one. It's worth pointing out that part of the reason for that is that people are living longer. It's not just the baby boom, but once you cross that magic threshold. And by the way, you're right. I was born around the time that Harry Truman was sworn in for a second term. I don't remember much about it, but I was alive then. So it's not just that you live long, that there's more people entering the age group, but they get there and they hang around longer. So those are two important parts of the demographic picture. Another link to the living longer question is what demographers call the living better question. Are we living healthier as we live longer? And the evidence is mixed. In the 90s especially, starting in the 80s and it's definitely in the 90s, and a big question mark since then, the prevalence of disability in the older population was steadily going down. And at least superficially, that would imply that it will cost us less. The older population will cost us less per capita, at least, per old person in the future, if they're in better health. The problem is that appears to have stopped. And if you look at the younger groups that will be joining the older population in the coming decades, they're getting worse. Diabetes, obesity, and a number of other health problems. portend a less pleasant future than recent past, which is unfortunate. So the three program areas, the three big programs at issue here have already been mentioned: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And of those three, Medicaid is a little bit special because it's not aimed only at older people. It's aimed at poor people. So I'm going to put that off for a minute. I think it's fair to say that the Romney-Ryan team, in other words, I think it's fair to say in the sense that they would agree openly that they don't like government programs a lot, and they would like them to be smaller. And I went to Romney's website, and it says pretty much that. Now, what they don't say, but I think is also true, is that one of the reasons to like smaller government programs is that it gives you a greater rationale for lowering taxes, and they definitely don't like taxes. So this would help them in this other big thing that matters a lot to them. So the problem, one of the problems, is that there seems to be very widespread support in the population for these big programs that benefit older people. There's certainly a lot of support for Social Security benefits. There's a lot of support for Medicare. Medicaid's a different animal. I'm going to hold that off for a minute. So the things that I'm claiming the Romney-Ryan team either overtly or covertly want to achieve they come in conflict with the things that a large share of the population sort of is on the record of saying that they want. And also into the mix, we have to put the fact that there's, in addition to lots of support for Social Security and Medicare, there's lots of misunderstanding and misconception about what the programs do and how they work. So this creates a problem for Romney-Ryan because they need to appear at least to be preserving Social Security and Medicare. But just like the debate last night, it's like the dialectic, right? For every butt on this hand, there's a butt over here too. The projected budgetary pressures associated with Social Security and Medicare are like this wonderful thing for the Romney-Ryan point of view because they create a rationale for a justification for cutbacks. Cutbacks to keep they can say we're going to cut it to save it because it can't be sustained the way it is. I don't want to get into linguistic and metaphysical stuff, but there is sort of a what they say versus what they mean issue going along here. So if you think about Social Security and Medicare, and I said a minute ago, there's a lot of misconception, misunderstanding about them. One of the biggest problems is that they're popularly portrayed as insurance, but they don't really operate like insurance. And over the decades that Social Security has been in existence, it's become part of the lore of how you speak about Social Security is that beneficiaries are getting back what they put in. So that implies there's a strong connection between the contributions and the benefits. Unfortunately, there's lots of reasons why benefits diverge from contributions. So there's lots of wedges between what you put in and what you get back. It may not be widely appreciated that there's a substantial welfare as in public assistance component to Social Security. People who have made contributions at the low end most of their life will get more back proportionally than those who have been at the high end their whole life.
If they live long enough.
If they live long enough, yeah. No, we got to hold some things constant here. Furthermore, another thing that stands and that drives a wedge between what you put in and what you get out is the spouse benefit in Social Security, because you didn't put in extra money for your spouse. You just get extra back because you have a spouse. Moreover, former spouses can also collect, and I've been in conversations where people talk about what's the maximum number of people that can collect a benefit from one earnings history, and Basically, a divorced person can collect on the earnings history of someone they were married to for at least 10 years. So, if you time your marriages and divorces right, you can support a lot of old people, a lot of people in your old age. It sounds funny, but it's another example of how the contributions and the benefits sort of begin to diverge from each other. Now, in Medicare could be described as though it's a kind of health insurance, but it's very unlike health insurance in the sense that the premiums are proportional to your income. Normally, premiums are in a conventional, abstract depiction of a health or any other kind of insurance situation. You try to calculate the expected benefits paid out to those for whatever thing is insured, and you collect premiums that equal on average the average payout. And you have to add a little bit of administrative cost, but basically the premiums are targeted to the expected payout. Well, Medicare is financed by this this earmarked payroll tax, so that people with lots of payroll pay lots of taxes. People with very little payroll pay very little tax, and the benefits you get in terms of the health services you'll consume once you're on Medicare have nothing to do with what you put in yourself. Now, Medicare is set up as basically a promise to cover certain services, and then a corresponding need to collect funds to pay for those costs. And Len had a graph that showed you this growing and growing and growing health cost component of the Medicare problem. If costs go up and you've promised to pay for a bundle of services, then you're going to have to spend more. So my reading of what the Romney-Ryan plan is, based upon the most superficial possible source, which is their own website, gives very little detail. And I looked at it for the first time this morning, so I'm kind of new to this. You can interpret what they want to do is get away from this promise to cover services. Len's talk made it clear that the problem is cost, right? And there's this tax thing you got to do to produce the revenue to pay the cost. So costs are going up. You can either try to control the cost or reduce what you pay for, reduce the things you say you're going to cover. Well, you can tell from the debates that have been happening that people want not to admit that they're going to take away any services. So what are you left with? You're left with what they're calling premium support, which is to say, I'm going to take away the promised bundle of services. I'm going to replace it with money in your pocket. You go out and buy insurance. You buy the insurance that best covers what you want. And we're going to rely on the magic of the marketplace and competition to make sure that there's a plan out there that'll cover what you want. The problem is whatever they say about the requirement that these insurance plans cover, be at least as good as their phrase is Medicare today. Does that mean that Medicare in 2012, like if this plan goes in 2020, it's still 2012 Medicare that has to be as good as that? I don't know. But they're basically saying, we're not going to try to control costs. Costs can do whatever they want. We're going to let you buy insurance, and you've got to eat the cost. So the costs keep going up. So if your insurance plan doesn't cover all those costs, you've got to figure out another way to pay for it. Or you decide not to. You decide not to get the services. But we're not going to tell you that they're not covered or you can't have them. You'll just have to come to that conclusion on your own. So I think it's easy to be skeptical about the underlying philosophy that guides this pretty large change in how Medicare would be treated. And it's hard for me not to reveal my personal biases here. I probably already have. Um, It also seems to me that this is kind of backdoor privatization by turning this promise to pay for services, which is accompanied by this massive problem of how the government's going to pay for them, turning it into basically a voucher or a piece of paper that lets you go out and buy insurance. Where are you going to buy that insurance? Well, you're going to buy it from a private insurer, right? So that the Romney-Ryan plan it introduces into the mix a big cost element that basically isn't there now, which is the insistence by the owners of private insurance companies that there be profits. You know, Medicare is a nonprofit government-operated sort of insurance program. So there's no need for Medicare to make profits now. But if you say, even if you say, here's a pot of money that's just as big as what we're spending on Medicare now, whatever that is, go out and buy insurance. What you get for that pot of money, you have to immediately subtract whatever the minimum demands of rate of return that the private sector insists be there, since it's now a profit-making operation where it wasn't before. And that's effectively lowers what that pot of money can cover. The other, I don't have much more to say. The other critique that you can see lots of material about on the web from various very smart people who know a lot about it is that premium support, as to the extent we know about it from what the Romney-Ryan team has told us, is sure to erode over time. And it's set up to make that easy to happen. So again, they don't have to admit that they're taking away services. They just peg the premium support to a lower rate of increase than the health cost index, and it sort of automatically erodes the value to the beneficiary of having that benefit. So the last thing to talk about for just a minute is Medicaid, which really is for poor people. But inconveniently, Medicaid now pays for about half of the nursing home costs in this country. Now, nursing home, the proportion of the population that's in nursing homes is going down. And that goes along with what I think the popular image of nursing homes is, as a place you don't want to be. People don't want it for themselves, they don't want it for their parents, their spouses, whatever. But there's a lot of money there, and there's a lot of people whose needs can't otherwise be met. The Romney-Ryan plan says we're going to turn it into a block grant, which means under the current law, the federal government establishes a set of standards and requirements, say if you're going to have a Medicaid program, and all the states do, it must cover this, this, and this, and at your option, it can also cover this, this, and this. And if you play by these rules, we'll pay half the cost. So Medicaid is half federal and half state. In New York, the state half is actually half state, is a quarter state and a quarter county, because or roughly, the New York State Legislature has turned around and said, well, there's a lot of money. Onondaga County, you pay for half of that. And the counties hate it because it's really expensive. So this is sort of upside down federalism, getting divided into smaller and smaller pieces. If you turn Medicaid into a block grant, the whole ability of the federal government to insist that you do this, this, and this, I think will be greatly undermined, if not outright eliminated. And I think their platform says they're going to greatly reduce the degree to which the federal government will dictate the terms of Medicaid. Well, if you reduce the requirements that states have to meet, give them money instead of paying the bills directly, and say, go ahead and run this program that we know you basically don't like already, what do you think is going to happen to Medicaid? It's going to get smaller. So I think we're faced with the very high degree of possibility that all these programs are set to shrink, and they're set to shrink a lot more under one set of policy proposals than another. So that's my 5 minutes.
I just have a couple comments. So I like the idea of premium support in the sense that I like the idea of sort of setting a budget for what the government is paying for. The problem with relying on private insurers, beyond what Doug said, was I think about 80-year-old people who are trying to decide between 10 different insurers. I mean, I think people are going crazy now trying to figure out which prescription drug benefit to take. The other thing is that besides for just the profit, I mean, the marketing costs and there are fixed costs to running insurance, which each one of the insurers has to cover. So it's just, you know, the advantage of choice, and the advantage of choice is that you have options. You might have different insurers that are offering you different packages of amenities that you can select from. The disadvantage is that does come at a cost, and given that we're already spending so much on healthcare and that the costs seem to be growing uncontrollably. I mean, the question is whether there's some other way that maybe you could use market forces to drive prices down without imposing all of these other costs. For example, you could use the private sector to administer the payments, but have insurers bid on who would cover a particular area. So you wouldn't be offering a choice, but basically just giving them an incentive to find, you know, different ways to lower what they pay for. And Medicaid, I mean, one thing that's I think important to stress about Medicaid is that the cuts that are being talked about are draconian. I think, does it grow at the rate of inflation, or is inflation plus 1%? Is that what they?
The block grant?
The block grant.
I don't know. I didn't see that.
I think the block grant, is it inflation plus 1? Yeah, so healthcare costs have been growing, and actually, you know, account for demographics too. I mean, it would be probably 3 or 4% faster than that every year, maybe more. You know, you build in the power of compounding, and very quickly the difference between the costs that we're covering under current law and what they're proposing under the block grants would get to be really, really big. And you know, the scary, you know, if you want to look for an analogy to what might happen under Medicaid, you can look at the cash welfare program, temporary assistance for needy families, which was turned into a block grant in 1995. And states have actually diverted a lot of that money to pay for things that weren't part of traditional welfare, and they've gone to great lengths to cut people off of their rolls. So there are many, many fewer people covered by TANF now than there were in 1995, and it's not because there are more people that are working or more people above poverty. It's basically because of the efforts states have made to make it really hard for people to claim that benefit. And presumably, you would see something similar with Medicaid. You know, the one thing Medicaid actually has going for it is that there are a lot of middle-class families that have older loved ones who have depleted their assets and are actually using Medicaid to pay for a nursing home. But you know, that said, one of the things that's most distressing about the debate we're having now is that we really do have to come up with ways to cut spending on Medicare and Medicaid. And the Democrats have excoriated the Republicans for the cuts that they've proposed under the premium support and the block grants. And there's certainly legitimate issues. The Republicans have attacked the Democrats for taking another approach, which was to eliminate payments for what they thought of as costly services. The famous $714 billion that President Obama is supposed to be saving in the Affordable Care Act. Mostly it comes from cutting payments dramatically to the Medicare Advantage plans, which are an extremely expensive way, and these are private insurance companies that offer an HMO benefit, and it's an extremely expensive way of providing health care to seniors as compared with traditional Medicare. And one of the ironic things is that Paul Ryan actually had that in his budget too, even though he now criticizes the administration. You know, the point, the thing that's disconcerting is that we should be able to talk about ways to cut the spending without it becoming about death panels and you know, becoming this enormously supercharged issue. And it's really scary because if we don't figure out how to control healthcare costs, it will bankrupt the federal government. It'll bankrupt the private sector as well. It will be harder and harder for people to afford health insurance. It'll be harder and harder for people to afford the portion of medical expenses that aren't covered by Medicare. Kevin, I think there's a microphone.
I'm supposed to be moderating there. Can either of you speak, I'll just speak loud enough, about speaking on the Affordable Care Act, what the impacts would be on, or what the impacts are, given that the law was upheld, on the Medicare program and on Medicaid, and if there's any sort of cost measures that would keep them from growing so large?
The Affordable Care Act actually expands Medicaid.
Yeah.
It raises the eligibility from 100% of GDP to 133% of GDP. And that's actually something some states have objected to, even though the federal government is paying like 90% of the cost for the expansion. Actually, one of the other things that the Romney-Ryan plan would do is would raise the age at which you're eligible for Medicare slowly over time, which with the Affordable Care Act is actually plausible. I mean, one problem now is that people get to be 62, 63, 64 years old. If they leave their career job or they lose their job, they can have a really hard time getting health insurance because older people often have high medical expenses. Under the Affordable Care Act, their premiums will be limited. Basically, there's guaranteed availability of health insurance, and there's subsidies for lower income people who can't afford to pay the premiums themselves. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, which Governor Romney would do, then it becomes much more burdensome to actually raise the age of eligibility for Medicare.
That's one of my weak spots. I'm not as familiar as I should be with the ACA interactions with Medicare, Medicaid.
Well, you're counting on it being repealed, right?
No, I'm happy to have the federal government take over healthcare.
I actually have a question about raising the age of the retirement age. If people are living longer and, well, maybe now it's getting worse, as you were saying, but if people are living longer, it hasn't been raised. I mean, other countries have raised
never been
their
Well,
age. Is it not reasonable to do that for other reasons outside of money saving?
Well, the Social Security age actually was raised. Not Medicare, but Social Security.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's at the time that the Social Security Act was passed, life expectancy, which is the same as the average age of death. So, like, on average, people died at age 65, and that was the age of full benefits, and that stayed that way till, well, after 1983. I'm not sure what the first one in the 1983 amendments that started to inch up the age of eligibility for full benefits from so that it reaches age 67 and stays there. You can say that demography got way ahead of the program there.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done a deep study of this. Just on the face of it, it seems to make sense to raise the retirement age as life expectancy has gone way up. But the people who are intense partisans of the world as it is now have got lengthy papers on why that's a terrible idea. I'm not able to reconstruct the arguments.
The primary argument they make is that lower income people have got shorter life expectancies than higher income people. And there's a point to that, but actually I was on a commission that was charged with trying to find a way to get the debt under control, Bipartisan Policy Center. And what we proposed was simultaneously to raise the minimum benefit. So people at poverty level would actually get a higher benefit than they do now, but also raising the full retirement. I think we didn't frame it as raising the full retirement age. We had some sneaky way of doing that. But in any event, we would have phased in an increase in the retirement age, but lower income people would be in a position where they could still retire and retire at the time they do now and get basically the same as they would get under current law. And we tried to find ways of identifying, for example, tying the benefits to more years in the workforce, because you think about people like the people in this room have spent many, many years in college when their peers are otherwise out working. But it turns out that the number of years in the workforce isn't that closely correlated with your income level, in part because lower income people are more likely to have spells out of the workforce because of layoffs and other things. It's a complicated issue.
I think a counter argument is that the people who advocate greater increases in at least the Social Security retirement age, I don't think they're advocating dropping early retirement at age 62.
Mm-hmm.
So that, you may say, well, that just allows you to be punished longer, but at least the access to that reduced benefit it does remain in place, and that is arguably helpful to the low-income people.
Yeah.
They may not live as long, and they don't have as big a benefit to collect, but they can still collect it starting at age 62.
Do either of you have any opinion, affection, or disaffection for the Simpson-Bowles budget plans proposed in 2010?
So the Simpson-Bowles budget plan basically it was similar in a lot of respects to the Bipartisan Policy Center plan on the spending side, in part because Alice Rivlin was one of the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Policy Center group, and she was, after that started, she was also selected for the Simpson-Bowles group. I think their spending cuts are bigger than what they are in the Bipartisan Policy Center plan, and you have to look at what the incidence of those spending cuts would be, and their tax increases were not they didn't rely as much on taxes. I mean, the one thing that was left out of the Simpson-Bowles plan was any kind of short-term plan to try to get the economy out of recession. So there was a concern that immediately starting to raise taxes and cut spending would actually harm the economy. It could push us back into a recession. So that's one problem with it. There have been people who've been very, very critical of the spending cuts that were proposed in the Simpson-Bowles plan. The other thing is that the tax part, I think, was wildly unrealistic. And they proposed wholesale elimination of tax expenditures and use that money in part to raise revenues and in part to cut tax rates. And it's not clear that that kind of a cut in tax expenditures would be anything like that would be feasible. But I mean, the good thing about it was that it could be a starting point for negotiation about the way to get the debt under control, but I think you really do have to worry about the macroeconomic effects of that plan in the short term.
Yeah.
And earlier, one of your slides, and I forget exactly what the parameters were, showed a continuing federal budget deficit of roughly about $500 billion a year out into a series of out years. Is that a sustainable model? I mean, on one hand, the concern about the effect of increasing taxes on the economy. Well, that Simpson-Bowles was 2 years ago. The economy is somewhat better. It seems every time we talk about taxes changing one way or another, there's this silhouette that this causes damage this way, this causes damage that way. You can't get any agreement that tax cuts stimulate the economy. People go back in history and find, there's no proof it does that. The tax increases damage the economy when you have quantitative easing showing up with the Federal Reserve under apparently nobody's control. How do these things interrelate? It seems to me there's always some reason don't do that because we have a boogeyman in the closet that's going to create some kind of national disaster. Never quite sure the boogeyman's real. We seem to be caught in a real difficulty with a mismatch with our revenue and expenses with no will whatsoever to deal with it. I suppose one idea is, doesn't matter. We owe it to ourselves. We get $30 trillion in debt, kind of so what? It doesn't play well psychologically. Most of us don't believe we can run our personal lives that way. I guess what's kind of troublesome is where do we go that begins to head towards a possibility of a solution in this kind of a situation and not just nibbling at the edges with a credible, nonetheless kind of discouraging always consideration of some degree of damage that may or may not happen.
The,
Frustrating.
you know, I've been working on this issue for a long time, so I understand your frustration. I mean, most economists actually do believe that raising taxes and cutting spending during a recession is a bad idea. Now, you wouldn't tell that from the political debate because it sounds, but even, you know, when Republicans talk about defense cuts, they're all Keynesians. They're only not Keynesians when they're talking about cuts in programs that benefit low-income people. I mean, they say that you'd lose all these jobs if you actually cut defense spending over the next 10 years. You know, most of the people who look at this, or a lot of people who look at this, would like to have short-term economic stimulus, probably maybe more aid to state and local governments so they could actually hire back some of the people who they had to lay off during the recession, which compounded the economic problems. Maybe, you know, some, you know, extending the payroll tax cut or something like that to put more money in people's pockets to help the economy recover more quickly, and a credible mechanism to commit to getting the debt under control when the economy recovers. Coming up with such a credible mechanism is really hard. I mean, the things that most observers think would be very helpful is strong presidential leadership. The president has to take responsibility himself and say that, you know, this is a really high priority for me. I'm willing to take the political flak for this, and some kind of bipartisan buy-in, because it's really easy for one side to attack the other side for plausible things that would get the budget under control. That happened with the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It was Ronald Reagan and a Democratic Congress who worked together, but the political environment has gotten so much more partisan that it seems less likely that that could occur now. I mean, I was sort of hoping that Rick Santorum would be the presidential candidate on the Republican side this time, because I thought he would totally get his butt kicked, and then the Republicans would figure out that being crazy wasn't a good strategy, and that there'd be more, you know, that they could be actually more like Mitt Romney has been in the last week, you know, a conciliatory, you know, Republican who can work with people in the other party and is not an ideologue. I guess I've I've revealed my own partisan biases here, but I don't know. The only thing I think of that gives me some comfort is the old Winston Churchill line that Americans can be trusted to do the right thing when all the other options have been exhausted. We're close.
Yeah.
Actually, a question about this particular graph. So I know that you had mentioned too that Romney is not very specific on his budget, but I wonder if you could speak to how the Ryan budget would look comparatively to this, or how, if they were elected, what would the impact of the deficit be?
So the Ryan budget actually increases deficits from this chart over the next 10 years, and most of his savings come in the out years. You know, so one of the criticisms of the Ryan budget is that there's immediate tax cuts, and it takes a while for the spending increases to take the spending cuts to take effect. And one problem, a problem with the plan that I proposed, where you stimulate the economy in the short term, and then you have, you know, this tough stuff you're going to do a few years down the road, is that Congress has got a really bad habit of not actually following through with the tough, or repealing the tough stuff when it actually starts to bind. So I mean, actually, one of the differences between the red bars, the Obama budget, and the blue bars, is that the red bars included, the blue bars include this cost-saving measure. Payments to providers under Medicare were going to be cut pretty significantly. And this was a great idea to cut Medicare spending. And providers have said, well, you can do that, but we won't see patients anymore. So the red bars include what's called the doc fix, actually paying doctors enough so they're actually willing to see patients. So Congress is really good at agreeing to plans that are going to be really tough a few years down the road. and then they're also really good at undoing them before they actually take full effect.
Just on that point, it has often seemed to me that one of the major arenas of dishonesty in the whole health cost arena is that given the actors that are in the system, the only way to reduce the cost of health care, well, significantly, any approach to making a noticeable dent in the cost of health care has to imply that somebody's going to make less money. And who do you think the somebody is? I think it's going to have to be doctors, and doctors don't seem to be interested in making less money. No one who's proposing plans to try to get health costs down is saying, I'm going to get health costs down by making sure doctors don't make as much money. It's just not a very smart way to approach it. So you got to come up with something else that sounds palatable and will work, and I have no idea what that is.
And actually, yeah, but there are things we know that would work to lower healthcare costs, would make more sense than cuts in payments to providers, like spending more on primary care and less on specialists. But of course, the specialists don't think this is a great idea.
Right.
Yeah, so my question kind of builds off of this. It seems like one way in which healthcare costs could be reduced is to kind of incentivize consumers to choose cheaper alternatives. We're rather risk adverse when it comes to healthcare, and willing to choose the best doctor, which may not be the cheapest, even though they can perform the same surgery as effectively. Or you could say generic versus non-generic prescriptions. Obviously, this wouldn't be politically acceptable, but are there ways we could incentivize consumers to make these choices?
I guess, well, there could be a fat tax. There's, I don't,
Yeah. Right. So health savings accounts and high deductible health plans were intended to encourage people to take more responsibility for their own medical care by saying that, the first $5,000 that a family spends on health care would come out of pocket. It wouldn't be covered by insurance. The problem with that is that it's not clear that it actually makes that much difference in terms of overall medical costs. For one thing, the people for whom those plans are most attractive are the ones who are really healthy, who weren't going to spend much money anyway. Second of all,
I've seen it and adopted it. People who were going to spend a lot of money also adopted it because they just immediately, met their deductible, and then they were paid for the rest of the year.
So the second problem is that you can keep the microphone. So I'm going to make up more stuff, and you can correct me. But the second problem is that most of the medical costs are incurred by people who have really, really high cost diseases or conditions. And once you hit the deductible, you've got insurance. It's just like anybody else. So at that point, you're making decisions pretty much the same way anybody else is. So it might cause people to get physical. Well, actually, a lot of plans cover physicals anyway, but it might encourage people to avoid some relatively low-cost procedures. But when they get really, really sick, there's not really much of a difference. The other thing, of course, is that it's sometimes hard for people to figure out what they should be saving money on. And when the RAND health insurance experiment, they actually did an experiment. They gave people insurance plans that had different levels of deductibles, and they found that people were as likely to economize on things that really made sense, like getting important cancer screenings and things like that, as they were to economize on things that really were kind of marginal, maybe not worth paying for. The hard thing about healthcare is that at some point, we're going to have to figure out a mechanism to basically not use services that are technologically feasible but not worth the money. And it's easy to talk about that when you're talking about cars. And when people talk about Cadillac health plans, they make it sound like it's just like a choice between a Cadillac and a Buick, except that when you're getting the Cadillac health plan, you actually might be getting something that saves your life. It might make no sense on economic terms, and something that, if you scale up across the whole population, really would, contributes to runaway healthcare costs. But having people decide that we're not going to pay for everything the medical care could cure is actually going to be necessary at some point, and it's impossible. When you talk about that, you get accused of favoring death panels. But the Congressional Budget Office actually did a projection of what total spending on healthcare would be if healthcare continued its past patterns over the next 40 or 50 years. Total spending, not only the federal share, but also the private share, the portion you pay and you pay through your insurance. And by the year 2050, 2060, it's 50% of GDP. Half of everything the economy produces would be paying for healthcare. It's just not feasible. So, but that's really hard. I mean, saying, you've got this $10 million procedure that's just not worth it, even though it'll save your life.
But it's paradoxical that the trend goes to some place that can't possibly happen. Therefore, something's going to change that nobody can figure out what the change is going to be. We can't seem to do it in an orderly way, unfortunately. Some smart person once called that bounded rationality.
Okay. So my question is it's a little out in left field, but I think we're going to figure out a way to tie it all back. And as someone who was a nonprofit fundraiser for a while, a place where my heart kind of seized up was that part about eliminating charitable deductions. And so my question is how serious are we talking about that? And what does that mean for not-for-profit organizations in a climate where fundraising is so tough already? And period, question mark.
Okay, so the good news is that the estate tax is likely to stay around in some form or another. If they eliminated the estate tax, that would be terrible for philanthropy, because a lot of people don't actually want to give away money when they're still alive, but they're willing to make gifts that kick in once they're dead and they don't need the money anymore. And the tax system really encourages that, because you can save a lot of money on the estate tax. And there's a lot of evidence that it has an effect on philanthropy. The charitable deduction is probably one of the most popular, not only among the public, but politically popular provisions in the code. There are enormously powerful interests that want to preserve it, including a lot of institutions that really don't need more philanthropy, like Harvard, has got a big lobbying operation, and really another $1 billion to Harvard is probably not the best use of money, but more money to Syracuse would be awesome. It's a possibility that the deduction might be cut back. President Obama's proposal would lower the value of the deduction from up to 35 or 39.6% to 28%, but there still would be a significant incentive to donate to charity. So, my political prognosticator's hat on. By the way, I'm a terrible political prognosticator, but I would guess that it's safe. So at any rate, your heart shouldn't stop yet. I mean, because there's bipartisan support for the charitable deduction.
But there must, it must be true that a very large share of those who contribute to nonprofits are giving small amounts and don't itemize. Mm-hmm. So, and their behavior is therefore untouched by the deduction of charitable contributions, and therefore would continue. Now, there's spectacularly large gifts being given by people who get mammoth deductions for it, like the Koch brothers and the New York City Ballet or Opera, whatever it is. They're supporting a lot of cultural stuff in New York City. I like cultural stuff in New York City. I don't happen to like the Koch brothers, but there's a lot of trade-offs that have to be juggled here. And I don't know, it's very hard to come up with data that lets you answer these really fine-grained questions about this. And it's easy to come up with big sweeping arguments why it's a bad idea. So it's kind of hard to sort that out.
There's actually a split in the charitable behavior of the people who don't take deductions and the people who do. I mean, lower income people are much more likely to give their money to their church or some kind of organization that they're personally associated with, whereas high-income people like to give money to universities and art museums and operas and things like that.
So progressive, left-leaning agents of change type, they're counting on the small bucks from poor people, and that's safe. Don't you think?
So you're not even getting that much benefit from the charitable deduction.
I'd like to ask you about the capital gains tax, and if you, first of all, how does ours compare to other countries? And then also, what's the argument for reducing it, and how would your, what's your answer to that?
So there's a lot of variation around the world. It used to be that most of the English, the UK Commonwealth countries, the ones that had been in there, actually didn't tax capital gains, and the theory was that, you know, it's sort of all tied to this whole notion of an estate, and that you didn't actually own the estate, you were just sort of the steward for it. And if it passed from one generation to another, that, you know, it's actually not, it's not something you own. And of course, if you had to sell it, it was just a tragedy because you fell upon hard times, and you wouldn't want to penalize somebody in that situation. Most of those countries now do tax capital gains at rates that range from 15, 25, 30%. The capital gains, actually I wrote a book about capital gains taxation called The Labyrinth of Capital Gains Tax Policy, A Guide for the Perplexed. If you don't want to find out from the archives of dead books, I also have testimony that's on the Maxwell website from a hearing on capital gains a couple of weeks ago. The arguments in favor of a low tax rate on capital gains is that the kinds of assets that generate capital gains are risky, and you actually want to encourage people to invest in new businesses or to buy shares of stock. You know, when you look at what's happened over the last 10 years, thinking that too little risk-taking was a problem in the U.S. maybe would strain credulity, but that's an argument that people make. It's at any rate, the effect of capital gains taxes on risk-taking is a mixed bag, as I explained in the testimony in more detail in the book. One argument for a lower tax rate is that if you raise the rate, you wouldn't collect much more revenue, or maybe not any at all. And that's certainly plausible, because the way the capital gains tax works is you don't pay tax until you sell the asset. And if you hold the asset until you die, you don't pay tax at all. Your heirs get the shares or the company or whatever. There's this thing called the angel of death loophole. Michael Kinsley, who was a columnist, called it that when you die, your children who get your business, that it's as if they bought the company at the day you died, or they bought the shares at the day you died. They don't have to pay tax on any of the capital gains that accumulated over your life. So there are actually good reasons not to sell assets that have capital gains. I actually have done a lot of research on this, and my research suggests that the so-called lock-in effect, this disincentive to sell, is way smaller than conservatives had argued it was, and you can certainly raise the rate to 25 or 30% and still collect more revenue. The main arguments for taxing capital gains more like other income is, one, they're incredibly skewed towards higher income people. The share of capital gains that are earned by people in the top 20%, it's like 97% is earned by people in that group, and over 2/3 of it is earned by people in the top 1%. So if you want a progressive tax system, it's hard to do it with a capital gains tax rate of 15%. The other thing is that the lower tax rate on capital gains actually entails real economic costs. The advocates for cuts in rates say that, well, if you cut the rates, it'll encourage all this productive investment. But there's a whole lot of tax sheltering activity that occurs to take advantage of the fact that the capital gains rate's 15%, and your ordinary income tax rate might be 35 or 40%. And there's a whole tax shelter business that is designed to make 35% income look like 15% income. And there are a couple of ways that that's economically costly. I mean, first, it means that the tax burden is much less uniformly, a whole lot of income that was intended to be taxed ends up not being. Second of all, the things that people do to avoid to turn their ordinary income into capital gains are often economically, they're daft investments. They only make sense because of the tax benefits they generate. Basically, the whole idea is to generate a lot of deductions in the short term and ultimately get your money back down the road in the form of capital gains. And people do these just really, really crazy things. There was one tax shelter that involved buying the city hall in some Swiss canton and leasing it back to the people in that Swiss canton. The people there were happy about it because they got kickbacks for doing it, and somehow it generated income in Switzerland that wasn't taxed by anybody, and generated deductions in the U.S. that were enormously valuable to the person who engaged in the shelter. It's just goofy. The third thing is that the people who are involved in coming up with these schemes are actually really smart people who under other circumstances might be doing socially productive work. Like say trying to figure out how to make products that people would want to buy in the rest of the world. And instead they're spending all their time inventing tax shelters. So I'm not a big fan of the tax break on capital gains. But there are people who would fight me to the death over this. When I was doing a lot of work on this area, I would often talk about capital gains and start out by saying, welcome to the world of full contact tax policy. Any other questions?
We've answered them all.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.